Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This week on the show, legal matters. We look at three stories making international headlines. First, intention declared. Hungary announces it will be withdrawing from the International Criminal Court.
Without the ICC, the world would not have a general belief in the universality of justice.
Then, deportation orders served. Is Berlin taking its cue from the Trump playbook on campus clampdowns? And finally, verdict passed. A French court finds Marine Le Pen guilty of embezzlement. Those stories and more coming up on the programme. This week, the UN Humanitarian Affairs Chief, Tom Fletcher, demanded, quote, answers and justice after Israeli forces killed 8 Palestinian medics, 6 civil defence first responders and a UN staff member in an attack in southern Gaza. Also this week, Hungary announced that it will be initiating proceedings to withdraw from the International Criminal Court, or ICC, the world's only permanent global tribunal for war crimes and genocide. The announcement was made shortly after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived in Budapest for a state visit. Netanyahu is the subject of an outstanding ICC arrest warrant issued back in November. The warrant is for the alleged war crimes of starvation as a method of warfare, intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population, as well as the alleged crimes against humanity of murder, persecution and other inhumane acts. Arrest warrants were also issued for Netanyahu's former defence minister, Yoav Gallant, as well as 3 Hamas leaders, all of whom have since been confirmed dead. Already before Thursday's announcement of Hungary's intention to withdraw from the ICC, Netanyahu's visit was being seen as a test of the international legal order. On Wednesday, I spoke to Professor Tamás Hoffmann, Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, an expert in international criminal law, who was publicly calling on the Hungarian judiciary to enforce the ICC arrest warrant against Mr. Netanyahu. I asked him why he had felt that it was important to take this stance.
First of all, Hungary has a general international obligation to execute the ICC arrest warrants. Hungary has ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and under the Hungarian fundamental law, that is the Hungarian constitution, Hungary has to respect its international obligations. So by not executing the ICC arrest warrant, Hungary does not simply violate international law, but it also violates Hungarian constitutional law. Moreover, it also violates EU obligations because just 2 years ago, Hungary, along with other European Union members, has declared that it would execute arrest warrants.
What's at stake here? I mean, in terms of the Rome Statute, is that on the line? Is it that serious?
I wouldn't say it's that serious. I mean, you have to bear in mind that Hungary is the first European country and the first EU country to so blatantly violate its obligations under the ICC. Now, other European countries have suggested that they might not actually arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he visited.
I think I should, for transparency's sake, here say that one of those countries is, of course, Germany. The presumed chancellor in waiting, after winning the election, had a conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, after which he said that he would find ways and means for Netanyahu to be able to visit Germany and leave again without being arrested. I think I'd like to ask you about the importance of perception in terms of the legitimacy of the ICC and its ability to carry out its mandate, and the perception particularly amongst African countries, global south countries, that there is one set of rules for them and another for Western powers.
This is one of the most important reasons why the ICC should hold steadfast in this question, because for essentially the first 2 decades of the existence of the ICC, it only actually prosecuted perpetrators from developing countries. And there was this growing perception in the global south that indeed the ICC is basically a tool of neocolonization. It's just an instrument of basically injustice instead of being an instrument of justice. So these two high-profile cases, one of them is, of course, Russia, and the other one is Israel, in this respect, could clear a very clear message to the world that the ICC is actually willing to step outside this limited scope. It is willing to go after the big powers, the great powers. It's willing to prosecute, even in politically charged conflicts as well.
Should that fail? Should the perception be that the ICC is no longer fit for purpose as an enforcer of international law when it comes to human rights, war crimes, crimes of aggression? What is it that the world would lose?
I think it would lose a lot of things. First of all, without the ICC, the world would not have a general belief in the universality of justice. The creation of the ICC in 1998 sent a message that maybe this somewhat utopian ideal that we can have a world where law is applied both to the powerful and the weak as well is viable. So even if the ICC does not manage to achieve all its goals, its continued existence and its efforts at securing justice still sends a message that this ideal lives and worth fighting for.
Professor Tamás Hoffmann is a senior research fellow at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and a Bogdan Unyarski research fellow at the Lauterpacht Centre for International Law at the University of Cambridge. And from a lawyer raising the alarm about challenges to the international legal order, we turn now to a lawyer raising concerns about the domestic one, right here in Germany. Late last year, Inside Europe ran a Freedom of Expression special in which we looked at the potential implications of a parliamentary resolution titled Never Again is Now, Protecting, Preserving and Strengthening Jewish Life in Germany. Its supporters argued that the resolution represented a recognition of Germany's historic responsibilities and a much-needed response to the urgent issue of contemporary anti-Semitism, which is once again on the rise. Other voices, however, cautioned that the motion was employing a definition of anti-Semitism which is open to interpretations that could result in a significant clampdown on freedom of speech in relation to Israeli actions against Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. At the time, I spoke to Professor Matthias Goldmann, a prominent international law professor who had signed a public letter warning about the constitutional implications of the resolution. His greatest concern, he told me then, was that the resolution, and in particular provisions within it linking immigration and residency consequences to allegations of anti-Semitism, could pave the way to an undermining of the democratic order in Germany. It was, therefore, of Matthias Goldmann's warning that I thought when I read an investigation by the German journalist Hanno Hauenstein that was published by The Intercept earlier this week. Titled Germany Turns to the US Playbook, Deportations Target Gaza War Protesters, the investigation highlighted the cases of 4 young foreign residents, one a US citizen, the others EU citizens from Ireland and Poland. All 4 have been served with deportation orders issued by the Berlin State Senate Administration, citing their alleged involvement in Palestine solidarity actions, including a mass sit-in at the Berlin Central train station, a road blockade, and the late 2024 occupation of a building at the Free University Berlin. Of these actions, the latter is the most significant because it entailed property damage and an attempt to force police to free a student who had been arrested, a so-called de-arrest. However, The Intercept reports that the individuals in question are not accused of any particular acts of vandalism or the de-arrest. Instead, the deportation is reported to cite the suspicion that they took part in a coordinated group action and to accuse them, without supplying evidence, of supporting Hamas, which is designated as a terrorist organisation in Germany, the EU and the US. None of the students have been convicted of any crimes. Indeed, the only one of the four to have faced court proceedings, an Irish student accused of insulting a police officer, was acquitted. When I spoke to Professor Matthias Goldmann about these developments, he was quick to outline his concerns.
My chief concern is that we have to do here with the cancellation of the status of resident for students, which is most likely illegal. Not only for the 3 EU citizens, but also for the US citizen. And the problem is that it doesn't seem to bother the Berlin authorities very much. So we see a kind of implementation that is free riding, that is aloof of the legal requirements and the legal situation. And that is clearly a step into a authoritarian state. The problem is that that whole thing gets justified as a measure that is supposed to fight anti-Semitism. So we see here the full risk of the resolution adopted by the Bundestag, that it will open the gates for authoritarian measures under the pretense or under the pretext of fighting anti-Semitism.
Legal concerns were raised by a top immigration official who had objections on the grounds that none of the protesters had been convicted of crimes, but those concerns were overruled from bureaucrats within the Berlin Senate administration. Perhaps you could respond to that and also explain to me what the legal question here is, because we're talking here about immigration law, presumably.
Absolutely. We're talking here about immigration law. And let me start with the legal situation. So we need to distinguish the 3 EU citizens and the 1 non-EU student. EU citizens enjoy the freedom of movement of persons, and that gives them special protection. The reasons that justify terminating the residence of EU citizens are considerably strict. It's actually public security, public order, and public health. And the European Court of Justice has given a rather narrow interpretation to these reasons, in particular public order. So that requires that you are sentenced for a criminal offense. Actually, it even says that a simple conviction is not sufficient. So it has to be a conviction for something that has a certain level of gravity. It cannot be a minor infraction. That is for EU citizens. And we don't see that given in case of the students in question. Actually, one of them was even acquitted of the charge of having offended a police officer, and the Berlin Senate doesn't seem to be caring. Nevertheless, as concerns the EU citizens, there seems to be a certain moderation on the part of the Senate, because as far as I know, the revocation of their title of residence has been suspended. They're waiting for the legal proceedings to take place before they actually extradite them. But that alone is already a risk, because I think the Berlin Senate here is in blatant violation of the requirements under EU law. There is no way how they could ever meet that bar. The threshold is a bit lower for the non-EU resident, but even there you cannot just terminate status of residence at your discretion. There's legal requirements, so there also has to be a risk for public security, and that has to be weighted against, the impact that that will have on the person. So you have to take a proportionate decision.
Comparisons are being made with the case of Mahmoud Khalil, who is the University of Columbia student in the US who has been targeted for deportation by the Trump administration, and that was in relation to his role in student organising in support of Palestinians. Do you see parallels there between what's happening in Germany and what's happening in the USA?
Absolutely. I absolutely see parallels. I mean, we have to be aware that they're targeting students here in both cases. The critical discourse taking place at many universities is considered as a risk, and mainly as a political risk, by certain groups. So it's also indirectly, at least, an attack on academia, even though, the facts that are reproached to the for students in the German case did not take place at a university, but there are students. So the target is really academia here in this case. The second thing is also the outright disregard for legal rules. In both cases, I'm not an expert on US immigration law, but what you hear from that case is also that the US student didn't violate laws. He just made use of his free speech rights. And since he was not a US citizen, they simply thought they could get away with it. And here we have a similar case.
Matthias Goldmann is Professor of International Law at the EBS University in Wiesbaden and a Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg. DW has approached the Berlin authorities for comment and received this statement from the Senate Administration for the Interior and Sport. Quote, in March 2025, the State Office for Immigration, LEA, issued residence termination notices against 4 foreign nationals in connection with the incidents at the Berlin Free University on October 17, 2024. At the time, a group of people wearing masks and prepared to use violence forced their way into a university building. This resulted in significant damage to property inside the building, including graffiti relating to the, quote, Israel-Palestine complex, unquote, as well as other criminal offences. As far as we are aware, the criminal proceedings are still ongoing. No further details will be provided for data protection reasons. That's a statement from the Berlin State Administration for the Interior and Sport. You're listening to Inside Europe. I'm Kate Laycock in Germany.
The legendary escapologist Harry Houdini was obsessed with the afterlife.
I see a little boy. He is in a happy place.
Join me, Tim Harford, for a Cautionary Tales trilogy on the world's most famous magician and his campaign to ban mediums, a mission that would cost him friends and leave him fearing for his life.
They're going to kill me.
Listen to Cautionary Tales on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Marine Le Pen, until this week favourite to win the 2027 presidential election, has been found guilty of mass-scale embezzlement alongside 24 other members of her far-right National Rally Party. A French court found that there was, quote, no doubt about the existence of the scheme, which it said, under cover of fictitious contracts, served to remunerate people who actually worked for the party or party leaders in France. This was estimated to have caused a loss to European funds of between 2.9 to 4.8 million euros. Le Pen was found guilty of directly organising 8 fictitious contracts worth about 474,000 euros, but the court also said that she was at the centre of instigating the wider fake jobs scheme, which it said she undertook with what it described as authority and determination. Le Pen was handed a 100,000 euro fine and a 4-year prison sentence with 2 years suspended and the other 2 to be served under house arrest with an electronic bracelet. Most significantly, however, the guilty verdict comes with a 5-year ban on holding office. From Paris, John Lawrenson sent us this report.
I'm a fighter. I'm not going to let myself be eliminated like this.
Marine Le Pen reacting on primetime television to a judge's shock decision to ban her from running for election.
There are millions of French people who believe in me, millions of French people who trust me. I say to them, I have been fighting for you for 30 years, and for 30 years I've been fighting against injustice, and I will keep doing that to the very end.
European allies like Hungary's Viktor Orbán, the Netherlands' Geert Wilders and Italy's Marco Salvini voiced support for her, as did the Kremlin. In the US, Elon Musk posted, when the radical left can't win by the democratic vote, it abuses the judicial system to imprison its opponents. In France, the Prime Minister, François Bayrou, said he was troubled by the court's decision And far-left France Unbowed leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon said he preferred beating Le Pen in elections rather than her being disqualified by a judge. Both of these men have been accused of the same misuse of European-funded assistance. The charges were dropped against Bayrou, but Mélenchon's trial is pending. Generally, though, those on the left at least defended the judge's decision. France Unbowed MP Alexis Corbière, for example.
I can understand the concern of some of our fellow citizens, but imagine if the judge had taken a different one and ruled that the law shouldn't be applied in the case of a politician because of the political consequences that might have. Here, justice has been done. It puts an end to long years of impunity. Clearly, the responsibility of Madame Le Pen in this affair is central. She was a decision maker, so this isn't something that should be considered anti-democratic. When a baker, an employee, a wage earner, a citizen is sanctioned by the law, no one's going to say that because of his particular situation, the law shouldn't be enforced in its entirety.
But Le Pen's supporters say that, on the contrary, she has not been treated as an ordinary citizen, but has been singled out by a politicised judiciary. Her lawyer, Rodolphe Bosselu, says it is one thing to find her guilty and sentence her severely, quite another to punish her with a ban from elected office before the judicial process has reached its term.
This
judicial decision is a deliberate elimination of a candidate from the presidential race. The big problem of this ruling is that this elimination must take place immediately. Usually, sanctions of this sort aren't applied until after the final appeal. Until then, the accused is presumed innocent. To justify why this wouldn't be the case here, the judge said that because the accused had not admitted her guilt, there was a risk of her reoffending. Also, that allowing her to stand for election would pose a threat to public order. Both of these arguments are extremely surprising, to say the least.
Et quand je dis surprenant, je parle par euphémisme.
An opinion poll carried out just after the court decision showed a small majority of people were pleased with it. The courts have condemned major political figures in the past for corruption. For example, 2017 presidential favourite François Fillon and, more recently, former President Nicolas Sarkozy. Their guilty verdicts damaged their political careers, but they weren't banned from running for office. Public opinion is divided on this judicial disaster for Le Pen. Some are enjoying the irony that a politician who used to boast of clean hands has now been condemned herself for embezzling public money. Others believe the judiciary has overstepped the mark. Should Le Pen be unable to run in 2027, she has a successor in the form of the popular 29-year-old National Rally leader, Jordan Bardella, whose youth and humble origins invite comparison with the American Vice President J.D. Vance. For the time being, though, Le Pen is vowing to fight on.
Je vais mener les voies de recours que je peux. Il y a un petit chemin.
There is a path, a narrow one, but it exists for legal recourse that I am going to follow. I'm going to request in the strongest terms possible that my appeal be heard in time to reverse this decision.
D'envisager une candidature à l'élection présidentielle.
There is indeed still the possibility that if the judicial process moves forward quickly, her appeal will be heard in time to lift the election ban before the deadline for the start of the presidential race. Marine Le Pen may one day get her revenge. John Lawrenson, DW, Paris.
And there is, of course, also the fact that whilst Marine Le Pen has invested considerable energy in distancing herself from the most extreme elements within the French far right, there are other big players waiting in the wings who have not. However, that's politics, and for another day, maybe here on Inside Europe, with me, Kate Laycock, in Bonn. Welcome back to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. Coming up this half hour, some tough questions for Europe. Why aren't European leaders finding tougher words on Turkey? Can Europe really go it alone without US support? And is it prepared to step in to save Radio-Free Europe? All that plus the craziest spy story that you are ever likely to have heard.
A story of a very simple, ordinary girl who turned out to be a part of a big spy cell that's operating all across Europe.
Stay tuned. But in the meantime, let me reformulate that first question somewhat. Is Europe abandoning those fighting to keep Turkey's democracy alive? Because Turkey's opposition says that it is. Last Saturday, as many as 2 million people gathered in Istanbul to protest the jailing of the city's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu. The jailing of İmamoğlu, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's main political rival, and the resulting crackdown on protests has so far drawn measured criticism at best from European leaders and the EU. As Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul, it's a stance which is now drawing condemnation from the main opposition CHP party.
Rubber bullets, water cannons and mass arrests continue to meet protests over the arrest of the Istanbul mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, the man widely seen as Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's main rival. Despite the crackdown and İmamoğlu's arrest, the European Union has only offered muted criticism, with no threat of sanctions. EU Commission leader Ursula von der Leyen's recent careful use of words.
The arrest of the mayor is deeply concerning. As a Council of Europe member that Turkey is and an EU candidate country, Turkey must uphold the democratic values, especially the rights of elected officials. So we want Turkey to remain anchored to Europe, but this requires a clear commitment to democratic norms and practices, and it is key that Turkey respects these fundamental principles.
United Kingdom Prime Minister Keir Starmer, once a human rights lawyer, has remained silent over İmamoğlu's arrest, with the only comment made by one of his aides, who meekly said the UK expected Turkey to follow the judicial process. İmamoğlu's CHP leader, Özgür Özel, is slamming Turkey's European allies.
Those who play democracy at home and empower autocracy in Turkey, those who say we will give the money and have the Syrians taken care of, should know that this government will change next year. When everything is over, Turkey will remember the silence of its friends more than the voices of its enemies.
The UK and the European Union count on Turkey as Europe's gatekeeper for millions of Syrian refugees in exchange for billions of euros of EU aid. Erdogan's importance to Europe continues to grow as European leaders scramble to bolster their defence capabilities in the face of the Russian threat and an unreliable American ally. Home to NATO's second largest army, Turkey has been eyed as key to Europe's defence, according to Aslı Aydıntaşbaş of Washington's Brookings Institution, who says the protests against Erdogan are awkward for Europe.
Well, Turkey is more important than ever in an age of crushing geopolitical realities. It is in between two wars. President Erdogan has been very skillful in playing the West against Russia and United States versus Europe, etc. And so he has emerged as this indispensable middle power, not exactly an ally, but not someone you want to cross paths with. And Europeans are now interested in exploring whether or not they can have Turkey as part of European defense. Americans understand that Turkey is critical to stabilize Syria. So Western countries don't want to create a set of conditions where they push away Erdogan.
Even before Europe's tepid response to İmamoğlu's arrest and crackdown on protests, the opposition accused the EU of abandoning Turkish democracy. Turkey's non-governmental organisations, which continue to struggle to defend rights in Turkey, claim Europe dramatically cut funding in the aftermath of Erdogan's last election victory in 2023. Sinan Gökçen, Turkey's representative for the Swedish-based civil rights defenders.
There's a decline, hesitation by the international donors targeting Turkey. When it comes to individual country or intergovernmental funds, the refugee deal with EU is one of the key components of Turkey-EU relations, and nobody wants to upset that, actually. Nobody wants to make Turkey angry.
However, the opposition has no qualms about making Erdogan angry, with as many as 2 million people in Istanbul protesting İmamoğlu's arrest. Deputy chairman of the CHP, İlhan Özgel, says that with Turkey's democracy in the last chance saloon, he's disappointed with Europe's response, but says the people will prevail.
We're losing democracy. Every other day, a business person, a workers' union leader, a student, a journalist, a doctor, an ordinary citizen, an academic is taken into custody in Turkey. It's our authoritarian leader. We're going to deal with him alone. Millions of people are taken to the streets. So this is what we rely on. Not Western powers, or because they may try transactional dealings with Mr. Erdogan. But we're going to tackle this authoritarian regime. The people, the Turkish people, will handle this issue.
The opposition, CHP, is pledging to continue to organise mass protests across the country as it steps up its resistance. Meanwhile, mass arrests are predicted to continue, along with legal moves against the CHP itself, with Erdogan accusing the opposition of treason and rebellion. Whatever the outcome of the battle for Turkey's democracy, European leaders will likely be remembered as spectators. Dorian Jones, DW, Istanbul.
As we've just heard there, the temerity of European responses to events in Turkey is likely linked to the sense of existential threat which the current crisis in EU-US relations is provoking in many quarters. Trump's so-called Liberation Day has seen the bloc hit with 20% import tariffs this week. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen responded in the early hours of Thursday, saying that the bloc was, quote, prepared to respond. But even before that, the message that the EU can no longer rely on the US as an ally and partner had well and truly hit home, as our reporter Ben Batker found out when he attended the Europe 2025 conference in Berlin last week.
In what was hailed as an important step toward Europe's independent access to space, German startup ESA Aerospace on Sunday fired its first rocket from a Norwegian spaceport in the Arctic. Although the uncrewed rocket stayed in the air for less than a minute and crashed back to Earth in a powerful explosion, the attempt at an orbital flight, billed as the first commercial one of its kind from continental Europe, raised hopes of the continent addressing a critical gap in its ability to launch satellites into or beyond Earth's orbit. Verena Pauster, chairwoman of Germany's Startup Association, thinks the launch was an example of putting European sovereignty first.
We now need to be independent of Starlink or SpaceX and to have our own solutions and innovations. You can also look to fusion energy, quantum computing, biotech. Europe has so much to give in that area with world-class research and development, but we haven't been very good at bringing that into practice, and that has to change.
Reducing strategic dependencies, in this case on non-European satellite launches like the American SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, was one of the recurring themes at last week's Europe 2025 conference in Berlin.
We need a European Union capable of acting swiftly, decisively, and with a clear sense of purpose. Nowhere is that more urgent than in the area of defense. Europe cannot continue to rely on others for its security.
In a speech, German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius called for fundamental reforms to European defense policy and more self-responsibility for the continent's security in the face of what he called a new unpredictability vis-à-vis the United States. He also stressed the importance of close cooperation on armament and procurement, as well as an increase in defense spending and continued firm military support of Ukraine. In an unprecedented move, German lawmakers last month voted in favor of lifting the fiscal constraints on borrowing, known colloquially as a debt brake, in essence allowing for unlimited defense spending. The decision came on the heels of the EU unveiling its €800 billion Rearm Europe plan to bolster its defense industry and increase its military capability, as well as provide additional military support for Ukraine.
My name is Hanno Pevkur. I'm the Minister of Defense of Estonia.
Few countries have a greater sense of urgency about ratcheting up the bloc's defense capabilities than the Baltic states, all of which border Russia.
Bad peace in Ukraine is a bad peace for Europe. If the war will be over or paused, then Russia has the ability to redistribute some of the forces close to eastern flank of NATO. Globally, still the biggest threat comes from Russia. The Russian goal is the same as it was in 2007 when Putin held a speech in Munich, same as it was described in December 21, to have the buffer zone between Russia and the West. So this is what we have to take very seriously.
Pevkur cautioned that any post-war European reassurance force in Ukraine to deter future Russian aggression, proposed last week by France and the UK, could tempt Russia to test Europe somewhere else. As a result, he says the most urgent step Europe must take to secure a peaceful future is for NATO to double its average defense spending, which last year was around 2.2% of GDP among European NATO members. Another crucial area discussed at the conference in the context of strategic autonomy was artificial intelligence, or AI. Björn Ommer, who heads the computer vision and learning group at Munich's LMU University, says AI systems like ChatGPT are becoming the foundation all other technological developments depend on.
If we become dependent from the outside on this critical technology, we might end up where we've been with energy beforehand. We need more sovereignty, not just in the technology, but also in the ways that we can develop and that we can scale it up and bring it back into business.
One business that has this expertise baked into it is AI research agent U.com. Its founder, Richard Sucher, who has a PhD in computer science from Stanford University, went one step further than Ommer, warning that Europe could become something of a digital colony.
I think the biggest threat for Europe is to not realize how much AI and intelligence is going to be more accessible, used in every aspect of digital work and soon also the physical world. There's so much interesting research happening in physics, in chemistry, finding new battery materials, curing cancer, improving longevity. And if Europe doesn't do any of it, it will just be dependent on other countries providing those goods and services for them.
In Sucher's opinion, Europe needs to, above all, do 4 things to avoid falling behind when it comes to AI. 1. Make computer science mandatory in high school. 2. Reduce bureaucracy and increase support for startups. 3. Make venture capital investment in AI startups easier. And 4. Encourage large companies to acquire more small AI startups with tax benefits or similar incentives. German Startup Association chairwoman Verena Pauster echoed Sucher's demands.
At the moment we're investing early stage capital, but we're not really investing enough growth capital to keep the companies here long term. We have to become customer of these startups earlier, so buy the space shuttle before it actually takes off. And we have to bring the world-class research and development quicker and better into action and have to attract talent more quickly.
When it comes to reducing strategic dependencies in critical areas like security and defense, or AI, Europe has a lot to get done in little time. However, procurement cycles in the defense sector, for instance, can take 10+ years, time Europe might not have in light of increasing concerns about a possible attack by Russia on NATO territory before the end of the decade. As a sign of progress, German rocket startup ESA Aerospace reportedly signed a contract with the Norwegian Space Agency to put 2 maritime surveillance satellites into orbit by 2028. But it remains to be seen just how long Europe can afford to play catch-up in this new world order. Ben Badke, DW, Berlin.
And it's not just about Europe's ability to play catch-up, it's also about its willingness to fill in the gaps left by the US's new isolationist, or should that be isolation expansionist, course. One urgent example of this is the Prague-based broadcaster Radio Free Europe, or Radio Liberty, which is facing an existential crisis. The US-funded RFE is no stranger to struggle. For decades it was a thorn in the side of authoritarian governments determined to drown out its message. This time, however, its struggle is with its paymasters in Washington, who appear determined to starve it of funds. So, could Europe step in to save RFE? Rob Cameron has more from Prague.
A report from the Ukrainian region of Zaporizhia on the Russian-language TV and digital channel Nastoyezhye Vremya, or Current Time, getting the views of local residents on the prospect of a fresh Russian offensive. That report from Ukraine was overseen by the channel's editors based at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. RFE created Current Time as an alternative to Kremlin-controlled media in 2017. Current Time is now blocked in Russia for its coverage of Moscow's war against Ukraine. RFE's purpose-built offices in Prague now employs hundreds of journalists from Russia, the former Soviet Union and the Middle East, unable to work freely in their home countries. But with the station's future now under threat by the Trump administration, those reporters face a time of great uncertainty and fear. Pavel Butorin is Current Time's director.
I'm concerned about the future of my colleagues who only have passports from their home countries. They could be deported at any time. Many can't return to Russia or Belarus, for example. My own wife spent nearly 10 months in prison on a trumped-up charge and was only released thanks to US government intervention. But many of our colleagues don't have that protection. I worry about what might happen to them.
At time of writing, the broadcaster has been forced to start furloughing staff because the United States Agency for Global Media, which disperses RFE's Congress-approved funding, has failed to send any money for April. This comes after what had been a glimmer of hope for the station after the agency abruptly reversed a decision to terminate the broadcaster's grant agreement. Daisy Sindelar, who worked at the station for 21 years and was RFE's editor-in-chief until 2022, says even if the funding situation can somehow be resolved, the damage has been done.
A media organization, like any institution, like any living organism, needs stability and continuity to operate at its best. And we know, just from reading the news in this part of the world, that autocratic leaders further east from us are enjoying this moment in time. I've had friends in Russia contact me who are not journalists, who are not interested necessarily in developments related to RFERL, saying it's been on the news every night this week. Well, of course it has, because Russian propagandists are having a field day with the news that RFE is being destroyed by the government that used to fund it.
The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is now pursuing a Czech initiative to secure European support for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, if the Trump administration succeeds in starving the broadcaster to the point it can no longer operate. Daisy Sindelar says this could actually be a logical plan.
Philosophically, and I guess editorially, it's in some ways a very good fit, because the EU has been the recipient of journalists who have had to flee their home countries in the main. So over the past few years, we've seen our bureaus closed in Moscow, in Belarus, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Many of those journalists find a new home in the EU. The EU has been subject to disinformation campaigns waged by Russia, raised by Iran, and they understand that threat very well. The war in Ukraine is right at their eastern flank. It's something that they understand quite well. Of course, the heartening thing about the Czech support is that many Czech politicians have grown up listening to Radio Liberty when it was broadcasting here.
So far, 12 EU countries have said they would consider supporting RFE, which reaches 50 million people a week in 23 countries in their own languages, not just in Russia and Ukraine, but Iran, Afghanistan, and ex-Soviet republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Decried by Elon Musk as radical left crazy people talking to themselves, in this part of the world, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty still has many friends who remember it as a key source of reliable news and information during decades of communist rule. Rob Cameron, DW, Prague.
We've a spy story coming up next. That is here on Inside Europe, right after the break.
Hey everybody, I'm Kai Ryssdal, the host of Marketplace, your daily download on the economy. Money influences so much of what we do and how we live. That's why it's essential to understand how this economy works. At Marketplace, we break down everything from inflation and student loans to the future of AI so that you can understand what it all means for you. Marketplace is your secret weapon for understanding this economy. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
There was, I was told, a DW journalist in Bulgaria who had an extraordinary real-life spy story for me, the kind of story that it's almost impossible to believe. It sounds so crazy. Would I like to be introduced? Obviously, I said yes. The colleague's name is Alexander Detov, and this is the tale that he laid out for me.
It's a story of a very simple, ordinary girl who turned out to be a part of a big spy cell that's operating all across Europe, from the United Kingdom to Austria and Bulgaria. And of course, it all leads to Moscow. Actually, while living in Vienna, I think that I have seen this girl 1 or 2 times at some Bulgarian events or stuff like that. And I never would have guessed that a girl like her, who used to work as a cleaning lady back then, actually turned out to be a Russian spy a couple of years later.
That is amazing. I hadn't realised that you met her. So let's go back. Let's establish who we're talking about. Paint me a portrait of our central character here.
So yeah, our central character went to Vienna in 2014, where her mother lived. First, she was working as a cleaning lady, and then nobody knows what she did. I talked to people who worked with her, to a guy who was actually her boyfriend for a brief period of time, and they all were shocked because they told me she's someone who doesn't speak any foreign languages. Her German was very bad. She didn't speak any English, Russian. So very interesting how she worked actually with Russians. What it turns out that she actually didn't work directly with Russians. She worked with Bulgarians in the UK who are working for Jan Marsalek, this very notorious guy, businessman from Germany.
Hang on. I know that name. That was the boss of Wirecard, the company that notoriously turned out to effectively be a glorified Ponzi scheme and went bust in, was it 2020? When was it?
2020, after it turned out that actually billions of euros disappeared from Wirecard. He fled Germany, where Wirecard is actually situated, the headquarters, and nobody knows where he is. But according to the information that we got from the secret services of the UK and Austria and also Germany, he is in Moscow.
Alex, you said that you believed that you had met the central character here, Tsvetanka D, in Vienna at sort of Bulgarian events. But this is someone who at the time was, living life ostensibly as a cleaning lady with a bit of a penchant for online trolling with a pro-Putin bias. I mean, that was who she was at the time, seemingly. And yet she's coming into contact with someone like you as a journalist. Do you think, looking back on it, that might have been deliberate? Do you think you might have been a target?
I don't think so, because she became part of this group after the war in Ukraine started, or right at the beginning of the war. And I think that I saw her like 2016 or 17. But just to paint a big picture, you have these big Bulgarian groups, communities living abroad in Western Europe. We know each other, so to say. And as a student, I also took part in organizing some of these events. So I know a lot of people who live in Vienna from Bulgaria, who work or study there, and she was one of them. That is why I have her on Facebook, and what I witnessed is how she changed during the last couple of years. First, it was the pandemic. It was 2020, when all of a sudden this very positive and friendly girl actually became quite aggressive, sharing disinformation and propaganda about COVID-19. But then 2022, according to what she actually told Austrian police and the authorities, she was recruited, and she actually continued spreading propaganda coming from Russia, this time about the war in Ukraine. But the difference was that this time she got money for it.
So it begins with propaganda spreading for money, but it gets more serious. I mean, there are actually targets, people who she is asked to spy on as well.
She had to actually spy on the head of the secret services of Austria. We don't have public information about the way she spied on him and what she actually gathered this information because it's sensitive. But we know a lot from Mrs. Anna Thalhammer. This is the head of Profil. Profil is an investigative magazine in Austria. Anna Thalhammer told me in an interview what has happened to her. In the summer, she was called on by the authorities and informed that there is a secret operation against her and that a Russian cell connected to Jan Marsalek is trying to steal her laptop and her mobile phone, and that a Bulgarian girl is actually spying on her, which turned out to be this Tsvetanka D. Then you also have Hristo Grozev, who is born in Bulgaria. He's a quite famous, actually, investigative journalist. He worked with Alexei Navalny. He was a big part of this movie, the Navalny movie, which told the story of Alexei Navalny's poisoning. So Hristo Grozev was living in Vienna as well. And what Tsvetanka D had to do is to go to an apartment which was rented on the opposite side of his apartment and turn on cameras that would film his actions.
And she's not the only one. There are various other Bulgarians, also from very simple backgrounds, who have been implicated in the wider Jan Marsalek spy network. There may, of course, be others that we don't know about yet. Some of them now convicted in the UK at the Old Bailey.
They are still waiting for the final decision. 6 of them, 3 of them were convicted, 2 of them actually admitted of doing espionage and working with Marsalek. This is how actually she was recruited, because she was working with these people, she was reporting to them, they were reporting to Marsalek, and Marsalek supposedly was reporting to Kremlin.
Why do you think it is that Bulgarians particularly seem to have been such an attractive recruiting ground for Russian espionage activities?
First of all, let's bear the fact that before 1989, so before the Berlin Wall fell, Bulgaria was also a socialist country, a communist country, and it was an ally of the Soviet Union. So Bulgarian secret services worked together with the KGB back then. They were doing their dirty work at times. And until nowadays, there are suspicions that some Bulgarian operatives, to some extent, working for or sympathizing to Russia. Secondly, Russian propaganda is most successful in Bulgaria, in the European Union. It's very easy to recruit a person like Tsvetanka, for example, who was already spreading disinformation. People like Tsvetanka and a lot of the people that I know who live abroad are still very, very, very vulnerable when it comes to disinformation, manipulation, and also crime sometimes. So I feel a bit ashamed and worried, but I think that this can also be a good signal, a good sign for the Bulgarian authorities, the Bulgarian Secret Service, and the Bulgarian society that we need to counter disinformation and Russian interference because it's everywhere around us.
Well, Alexander Detev, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you for the invitation.
There are so many additional twists and turns to that story, which we didn't have time to go into, so I will be linking to Alex's reporting in the show notes so that you can find out more. That is it for today. This programme was produced by me, Kate Laycock, with help from Lavinia Pitu in Berlin, as well as sound engineer Ziad Abu Sleiman. Inside Europe comes to you from DW in Bonn.